I'm Richard Dolan. I'm here with my guest, David Marler. You can learn about David's book, I'm happy to say. Go to richarddolanpress.com. Yes, the new site is open. It's live. It's looking pretty good. I'm very happy with it. It'll be continually tweaked over the next few weeks and months, I'm sure, but I am happy with the site, richarddolanpress.com. You'll see right on the front page a picture of David's book, Triangular Ufos. Just click it, and you can read a little bit more about the book. But I've got the man here himself, David Marler. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Richard. How are you this evening?
I'm in a great mood. I just spent the entire last week, David, wrapping up your book.
I've kept you busy.
I'm very happy. It's been a long haul. I want to give a quick thanks to our friend Sam Aranto, who told me, our mutual friend, about that you're doing this book, because I think it's really worked out very well, getting to work with you. I've been interested in triangular UFOs for many years. I wrote an article on this about a decade ago, but you really did what I think many people have been waiting for many years. And I guess I would just ask, not the whole long bio as to why you got interested in UFOs, but what sparked you to get into the triangle phenomenon?
To be quite honest, when I became actively involved in UFOs and was actually a member of MUFON back in early 1990, the Belgian wave of UFO sightings was the hot topic at the time. And as I've mentioned in other interviews, it's one thing to see a point of light in the sky that's fleeting and you see it for just maybe a split second. But you have experienced, seasoned gendarmes in Belgium, military personnel, both on the ground and air, that are observing these triangular objects. And, of course, we now know the description of these things being immense, 200 to 300 feet in length, structured craft, lighting patterns, lighting characteristics that are specific to these objects. And it's as I describe in the book, I kind of categorize the triangular UFOs as unambiguous UFO reports, because it's not a matter of, did I see something? It's what did I see? Because it's essentially a very large object. As we know, they're known to fly very low altitude. Yeah. So it's a very personal experience for those that have actually witnessed these objects.
Certainly, the Belgian police officers saw one of these triangles, at least on one occasion. I think many come down very low. I mean, quite low, and these are quite large.
And in the Belgian case, as well as what I found historically going over about the last 75 plus years, they've not only seen solitary triangular objects, but groups, more than one triangular object seen in the sky at the same time. And that's been a pattern that's repeated itself time and time again when you really focus your research microscope on this particular subset of reports.
Mm-hmm. The triangular UFOs are, in a lot of ways, it sounds like they have performance capabilities very similar to kind of classic disc-shaped UFOs. Is that what you found?
There are. And as a matter of fact, I outline essentially 20 characteristics that time and time again, prove out as you review these cases. And I discuss that in the book. But as I do make a comment to your point, some of these characteristics are by no means specific to triangular UFOs. They're applicable to the disc-shaped reports, the orb-shaped reports. So, and again, even though I'm focusing on triangular UFOs, I don't necessarily think that they may be separate from the other UFO reports that we're receiving. There's potentially a relationship there, but unfortunately, I just don't have that link, that causal link that establishes that. But there may be some, and in some of the cases, there's actually interplay between non-triangular UFOs and triangular UFOs, which I focus on in the book as well.
Now, it's interesting regarding the Belgian wave of 1989 and 90. Of course, there was a lot of speculation at that time that, is this some secret American technology? I mean, the stealth fighter had just been revealed in late 1988, I think. Mm-hmm. So, and, the stealth fighter has a different kind of a shape compared with many other classic aircraft. So the question was immediately, well, weren't they seeing some kind of stealth aircraft? And what would you tell people about that?
Well, at the time, I would say that's a very logical argument, to suggest that it might be something American, some type of stealth technology. And in fact, in the book, I talk about some of the early cases over in England and some of the British UFO Research Association investigators. That was an explanation they were putting forth, that more than likely this is some type of stealth aircraft, possibly American or joint American English type of production craft. But now we have the passage of time. We have 30 plus years, and I think we can look back with a fair amount or a fair degree of certainty that that's not what was being observed, because certainly, even though that those craft had been unveiled around that time, we really didn't understand fully the performance capabilities of those aircraft. Now, with the passage of 30 plus years, we do know what the performance capability of those aircraft are. And when you compare that to the triangular UFO reports, beyond the basic triangular shape, that's really where the argument falls apart, because these, as we know, stealth fighters, stealth bombers cannot hover. They make noise. They're powered by traditional turbine jet engines. And a matter of fact, on that point, I was flying recently, and I stopped at a newsstand, and the May 2013 issue of Popular Mechanics, on the cover, America's Next Top Bomber, and it talks about the successor to the B-2. And when you look at that, even though a lot of it's speculative, they're still talking about jet engines powering these objects. They still show air inlets for the jets and exhaust ports and vertical stabilizers. Well, for anyone that knows these triangular UFO reports, these objects that people are reporting have none of those.
No, they're operating on a completely different type of principle. So can you talk a little bit about the famous COP sighting of January 2000? And I think this is a real key one in your own research.
It is. And, to be honest with you, you asked me what my initial interest was in the triangles. It was the Belgian wave, as I mentioned, but it wasn't until January 5th, 2000, where we had a series of sightings by police officers as well as other civilians near Scott Air Force Base, immediately outside of Scott Air Force Base in the surrounding area, where suddenly triangles became very personal to me, because I'm interviewing these individuals, I'm talking to them, getting their eyewitness testimony. And again, the sequence of events happened within 15 to 20 miles of where I lived at the time. So very familiar with the area, very familiar with Scott Air Force Base, having grown up in that area my entire life. But we had essentially...
I was just going to say, if you could describe this for people so they can kind of get a visual of what happened.
Absolutely. I was just going to say the sequence of events started around 4 a.m. We had a gentleman by the name of Melvern Knoll who had just arrived home from a truck run during the off season. He's an over-the-road truck driver, and during the summer season, he has a miniature golf course and family fun center. And he decided to pull in and check the pipes in his building because it was an extremely cold morning that January in 2000. And on January 5th, and it was approximately 4 a.m. And as he exited his truck, went into the building, he noticed this extremely bright star off in the northeast. And so it captivated his attention for a few seconds. Then he went in, checked the pipes, everything was fine. As he exited the building, he happened to look back to the northeast again, and he noticed that this light was larger, and it apparently was moving towards him. As it moved to the south of his immediate position, it went over a row of trees that outlines the south end of his property. And he described what essentially was a large flying house or rectangle with windows illuminated from the inside with a light shining outward. The object then moved to the southwest. And as I often have stated in interviews since this event, really Melvern was the hero of the story, because he essentially set into motion the next sequence of events. He went to the Highland Police Department, informed them of what he had witnessed, told them that it was heading in a southwesterly direction, headed towards the neighboring town of Lebanon. The dispatcher then relayed that information to a Lebanon police officer, Officer Ed Barton, who then essentially saw a series of lights off in the distance. As he maneuvered through the various county roads outside of Lebanon, he was able to then discern that it was, in fact, what he described as a large triangular-shaped object with a light at each point of the triangle and a strobing red light in the center. Mm-hmm. And the object was completely silent. Officer Barton pulled his squad car over, turned the engine off. It's an extremely rural area. You could almost literally hear a pin drop, and there was no sound. And in point of fact,
how low is it at this point? I guess
estimated 500 to 1,000 feet altitude.
Yeah, it's very low
and very large. And Officer Barton was a self-described military brat. He said, "Every aircraft that I've ever known of makes some type of noise. This object made no noise."
Mm-hmm. And then other people saw it after him.
And then it moved off in a southwesterly trajectory. Officer David Martin of the Shiloh Police Department observed a triangular object. Then Officer Craig Stevens of Millstadt, Illinois, observed a triangular object. And then there was an array of lights that was observed by Officer Matt Janey of the Dupo, Illinois Police Department. But in point of fact, even though this has been the narrative that we've discussed for many, many years, myself in particular, new information has come to light. So for anyone that thinks they know the January 5th, 2000 case, I'm here to tell you that there's new information in my book. There's new eyewitness testimony that has come forward, and I cannot take complete credit. My friend and colleague Daryl Barker, who also has very tenaciously investigated and tracked this case, both he and I have come across additional eyewitnesses just within the last year and a half. And we're now reassessing the January 5th incident, and essentially what appeared to be a solitary UFO may have been, in fact, 2 to 3 unidentified flying objects immediately outside of Scott Air Force Base operating in this general vicinity.
Yeah, that makes it really astonishing. When I read that in your book, I just almost gasped. And the reason is that these sightings were in such disparate areas and apparently at around the same time.
But in view of new information that has come to light, it actually resolves some discrepancies that Daryl and I had that we, by the way, never made public. I think that's an important point. And then these eyewitnesses came forward with their testimony, which resolved these issues that we never made public. And so now we have this seamless narrative with these descriptions, and it also pulls into the equation the reason why people were describing different types of objects. At first, we thought very pragmatically it was simply because they were viewing the same object from maybe different vantage points. And certainly with other UFO reports, we know that can be the case. You interpret it differently.
Sure.
What it looks like, though, is that we are now dealing with essentially 2 triangular objects and 1 rectangular object, which I know stretches credulity in many people's minds. But again, with the historical research that I've done, this is a pattern that has played out over the many decades when you start looking into these UFO reports.
Yeah. Fascinating. And, I recall when that sighting came out in 2000, I was just about to enter the UFO field publicly myself. I was just finishing my first book. I remember watching the television news describe this UFO sighting, and they played it up like X-Files music and Little Green Men, trying not to make jokes, but they were making jokes anyway. But then when they actually, the newscasters got down to discussing this in any serious way, they mentioned Scott Air Force Base, and the only speculation that you would hear is that, well, this might have been some kind of experimental aircraft out of Scott Air Force Base, and they left it at that. And I always wanted to know. I thought, well, that's wonderful. If the military's got something like that, then good for them. But isn't anyone the least bit curious as to what makes a big, huge triangle in the sky do what it does silently? And by the way, the final witness saw that object accelerate rather rapidly, didn't he?
Yes.
So we have an object going.
That's a characteristic that, again, that's the one thing when you look at the January 5th case in the context of the historical backdrop, looking at these other reports, because I've often stated to your point, and in almost agreement with these reporters, that if this was military, that would certainly be the most practical explanation. But I knew, of course, about the Belgian wave that predated this by 10 years. And then once I started delving into the historical research, I found reports that match Belgium, that match Southern Illinois, going back to the late 1800s. And this is all documented in the book.
Right. So let's talk about you want to discuss a couple of these earlier cases? I found them fascinating.
Absolutely. Well, we have a 1936 case from Eklutna, Alaska, a gentleman that had observed a large triangular object. He described it as looking like a flat iron. And both he and another gentleman were actually walking into a neighboring town, and it was extremely cold that morning. But he described this object coming over, and he described it as looking like a flat iron, which I would argue is roughly triangular shaped. But the interesting thing is, and again, take this statement in the context of what we now hear people saying, that all these triangles are something military. The gentleman stated this, and this is from 1936. He stated,
in Alaska, you said?
Yes, in Eklutna, Alaska, 1936. He stated, we thought it was something secret the government was doing.
Yeah.
And how many times have we heard that argument with modern day reports? And, at some point we have to concede that we might be dealing with something else here.
What was the date on that 1936 case?
We don't have an exact date. It was in October. It was on a Saturday in October.
I don't want to get too sidetracked. I came across a case in the Canadian National Archives a number of years ago from 1936, spring, way up in the Northwest Territories, out in the middle of nowhere. And an observer wrote back many years later that he saw this absolutely perfect object above him and then take off instantly and was at the horizon within moments. It wasn't triangular. It was like a kind of an oblong, almost like a flying saucer, I guess. But I just thought it was interesting because that's the same year, equally remote part of Earth.
Absolutely.
And, what are these things flying around in North America in these remote areas in 1936? There's a question.
Well, and related to that, I have a lot of people asking me questions about these objects, and there's really two key questions. One, what are people seeing? And two, how long have they been here? And I think if we can establish with regard to the second question that these things have been here at least 100, 120, 130 years, I think then that almost by default answers the first question, namely that these are not ours. These are not something that has been made by the military.
Yeah. I think it's a fair conclusion. It was, a number of years ago, as I mentioned to you, I wrote an article called What Are the Triangles? It's on my website. You can go check it out at my new revamped richarddolanpress.com website. I'm still pleased with that article. And on that one, I sort of played both sides of the fence, though. I mean, I was writing this in 2003 thinking, a lot of people argue that there are the kind of black ops sort of like the Black Manta, the TR-3A and 3B. Those are rumored to exist. Of course, no one's really gotten any absolute confirmation of it. That's the problem with it.
Correct.
And so I wondered, well, are we making something like that or not? But on the other hand, the performance capabilities are just so off the charts advanced that I thought, I don't really know that we're making them. And
I would argue that they're advanced by today's standards. And if you can look back to the late 1800s and the early 1900s, certainly I think any logical individual would argue that it's definitely beyond our capability back then.
Yeah. And you got John Alexander to write the foreword to this book, by the way.
I did. Actually, John and I met at the Ozark UFO conference that you had mentioned earlier, and we met last year. And John had an affinity for my research. He, as most people know, John's extremely fact-based. He doesn't like to go off on various tangents unless the evidence leads you there. And it was just rather serendipitous that, we actually met with each other. We started talking. He liked my presentation that I presented, essentially on the history of the triangles. Mm-hmm. And it was actually at that conference that it solidified in my mind that I was going to write a book. I had about 5 or 6 people approach me saying, where can I buy a copy of your book? I said, well, I don't have a book. So it was at the urging of some of the attendees. They said, well, you need to write a book. You've got some really good information. Absolutely. And then that in conjunction with, John Alexander, agreeing that, yeah, you have some really good information here. You really need to assemble this. So, and even in John's book on UFOs, he talks specifically about the triangular UFOs. And mm-hmm. finds the arguments, as I do, ludicrous that this is something that the military has. Not to say that we don't have triangular-shaped objects. I agree that there's probably a mixture of things that people are seeing in the sky. But really, at the end of the day, you can't argue the history. And we have a well-established, rich history of triangular objects demonstrating flight characteristics and physical properties that back in the early 1900s that people are reporting today. And I think when the reader reviews the book, they're going to be amazed at the consistency of reporting over decades.
Well, here's where I would chime in. First of all, John Alexander's my occasional nemesis from time to time. We've had we had a radio debate a couple of years ago, and we've always had this kind of, arm's length type of relationship. I mean, we've interacted so many times. But I think it's really great that you got him to do the forward. And certainly his perspective is that, yes, we don't have the capability to make anything like that. I'm not sure if I completely agree with that assessment. I do think that you're very wise to go take these reports way, way back, because if you go back 60, 70 years, 1930s and beyond, I do not see any way that any human agency could have made these things. I've occasionally speculated, though, that there are some deeply clandestine projects that are way beyond even what the United States military uses. I do wonder if there's an ET reality, let us just say for the sake of argument that there is. Mm-hmm. And if we assume further that we've acquired some of their technology, that some of the breakthroughs that we have made might be too advanced to segue into the ordinary course of technology and society, and even beyond what the military would be allowed to use if you were to be using this to deal with the UFO phenomenon itself. That's just my own speculation.
Oh, absolutely. And certainly, and with regard to any UFO reports, again, we can kind of step outside the bounds of just triangular UFOs. With regard to any UFOs today, certainly, when you look back historically at cases from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, we know with a fair degree of certainty what the level of technology was. So we can essentially rule out what might have been man-made versus maybe someone else's.
I mean, my feeling is,
the modern day reports, it's a little harder to tease out.
Yeah. I mean, even from the mid-'60s onward, I am still of the opinion that it's entirely possible that we created some version of our own flying saucer. You got the famous story in the 1980s of the ARV, the so-called alien reproduction vehicle. Mm-hmm. I personally give that story some credit, and that would indicate that we've got flying saucers that are going off-world. Well, if you got a flying saucer that goes off-world, why wouldn't you be able to have a triangle that can do the same? I'm just saying, having said all of that, I have to say you have put together a piece of research that I think other people who try their hand at this are going to be. You've set the standard for this subject, and I think you've made an outstanding case that at least some and maybe all of these are not of our agency, and they certainly are not of anything officially that we can do. That goes without saying.
Well, as I told a friend earlier this week when I told him the book was getting ready to be released, I said, I may not have defined the answer, but I think I've helped refine the question.
Absolutely. And I just want to point out, this book is beautifully illustrated. You provided images that I had never seen a lot of these from before. You got them from a lot of obscure newspapers that are long out of print. You have yourself an incredible collection of newspapers and other documents, don't you?
I do, and that's another reason I was being encouraged to write this book, is that I had a lot of rare information that was not readily accessible to most people. I think for the vast majority, most people go to the internet for accessing UFO information, and I should make a statement that the vast bulk of my book is not derived from internet sources. It's derived, to your point, from newspapers, newspaper archives, declassified military documents, as well as personal interviews I've conducted with eyewitnesses.
Which really points out that what you've got is so completely unique. And even the cases that you discussed that other people have looked at, whether it's Belgium or the Illinois case, you really bring in a lot of new information that I think most people have not encountered. And then all of the old cases. And plus your analysis. I think you do a really fine analysis breaking down a lot of the characteristics of these triangles that I think people are going to be very interested in. So I am excited, and I'm so pleased to be involved in any way that I can with this project, and I just want people to know you can read about David's book, Triangular Ufos, An Estimate of the Situation by David Marler at my website, richarddolanpress.com. You'll see the link right there, and just click on his book, and you can read everything about it. You can pick it up as a printed book or an ebook, and I really believe that this is a book that will have a lot of staying power. And I believe that it's one of those books that it is going to be a must-have for any serious student of the UFO field. So, David, I want to thank you for being on here. And I hope you have a great night and enjoy your newfound success as an author in the UFO field.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you for your support throughout this entire project.
It's been my pleasure. Well, we're going to take a quick break. I'm Richard Dolan. I just was here with David Marler, author of Triangular UFOs, An Estimate of the Situation. I'll be back in a couple of minutes. Don't go away.